Hello, everyone, and welcome to our monthly drought briefing for areas in extreme and exceptional drought in the Western US. This webinar series grew from a collaboration in the Southwest Drought Learning Network, and I would like to acknowledge the USDA Southwest Climate Hub and the Colorado Climate Center for their role in organizing this meeting today. This monthly webinar gives an update on Southwest drought conditions and resources. This is the fourth of what we anticipate will be several monthly webinars in the region. We plan to do these on the third Friday of every month for as long as the Western region is experiencing these extreme drought conditions. However, the next one's going to be an exception. Next month, we're going to be doing the webinar on the second Friday, which is Friday the 12th at 11 a.m. Mountain Time, and that's currently planned to focus on snowpack. My name is Joel Lisenby. I am the Regional Drought Information Coordinator at the Intermountain West and Southern Plains regions at the National Integrated Drought Information System, or NIDIS. Just a little bit about NIDIS, if you're unfamiliar with us. It's our mission to help the country move from a reactive to a more proactive approach to managing drought risks and impacts. And you can learn more about us at drought.gov, which we're going to be learning more about later in this meeting. To begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land each of us is on today is the ancestral land of tribal and indigenous cultures, and I pay my respect to their elders and chiefs, both past and present, and I welcome all tribal and indigenous peoples who are joining this webinar today. The format for today's webinar will be a presentation by our two invited experts, followed by a time for questions and discussions at the end. We plan to wrap up at about 11:30 Mountain Time. With a group this large, we found that the Q&A session goes smoother if you will please type your questions into the question box, which in the GoToWebinar software, that's a little different than the chat box. You'll see one that says chat and the other that says questions. Go ahead and type into the question box. And at the end of the meeting, we will direct your questions to the panelists and they'll answer it. The questions will be moderated by Maud Dynan. Maud is a program specialist at the USDA Southwest Climate Hub. She primarily works with drought adaptation for agriculture committees, and she helps develop events and resources that make drought knowledge accessible and actionable. So I'd like to welcome Maud, and at the end, we'll be hearing from her as she moderates the questions. We're going to be making these webinars accessible after the webinar is over. Everyone is muted, and this webinar is being recorded. The recordings will be made available at the Southwest Climate Hub YouTube channel, which I'm showing here. Also, we'll be putting it on drought.gov, and you can also find it at www.drought.gov/webinars, and you can find an overview of the webinar there. I'd like to welcome and introduce today's speakers. Our first speaker will be Peter Goble. Peter is a service climatologist and drought specialist at the Colorado Climate Center based at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado. Peter will be talking about current drought conditions and forecasts across the West, especially the regions impacted by drought. And immediately following Peter, we'll be hearing from Kelsey Satolino. Kelsey is the digital communications coordinator for NIDIS, and she's going to give a brief demonstration of the new US drought portal, which is drought.gov. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Peter. Peter, I'm going to give you permissions to share your screen, and you can go ahead and start.
Sounds good. Let's see here.
It always seems to take a little longer to change this than we anticipate.
There it is. So show my screen, and now I should be up.
Yep, we can see that and hear you fine, so go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Joel, for inviting me, and thanks so much, everyone, for being here. Like Joel said, I will be doing just a quick review of some of the current drought conditions across the greater Southwest area of the US. I'm going to kind of have this divided into three sections of where we are now, how we got there, and what the next few months are looking like. So the US drought monitors, many of you have probably been staring at this map a lot in recent or many weeks. This is a look at where we are. It's the US drought monitors appraisal of drought conditions across the Western US with that D4 or exceptional drought covering significant portions of especially Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, as well as parts of California, Nevada, and Colorado. And then we see some pretty widespread D3 or extreme drought. Between D3 and D4, we're looking at conditions that are reflective of largely the bottom 5 percentile of conditions across the historical distribution for this area. Now, it's important to note, though, that the US Drought Monitor is standardized based on season. So, for instance, you wouldn't expect a D4 in February to match a D4 in July in terms of impacts. And I think that's the other important portion of covering kind of where we are today, is that it is winter. And that is important when we talk about drought conditions in the region, because our impacts of drought are so heavily seasonal across much of the Southwest. The winter is generally when we build our water supplies back up through snowpack in the mountains, but then the summer, when we're using that water, when it's ranching season, when it's growing season for general crops, that's when we tend to see the drought impacts hit if the water isn't there. Here's just a map on the right-hand side of departure from normal temperature over the last 7 days. So for a lot of the Southwest, it hasn't been that anomalously cold, but for much of the center of the country, boy, has it been winter over the last week or so, with snow making it all the way down into central and southern Texas. And when we have these cold conditions, it sort of has this impact of arresting drought impacts for the time being, or suspending them. But when you have really cold air, cold air also can't hold as much moisture, so it's harder to, in some senses, recover from drought when it's really cold out as well. Now, in terms of where we've come from, here is a quick map of historical rankings of precipitation statewide out of a range of 126 years, so going all the way back to 1895. This is based on weather station data from long-term weather stations. And if we look at the Southwest region for the calendar year of 2020, we see that it was recorded by National Centers for Environmental Information Climate at a glance as being record dry for both Nevada and Utah, and the second driest year on record for Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and then even in California and Wyoming, we saw top 5 driest year on record. And when conditions are this dry across the Southwest region for a calendar year, oftentimes it takes several years to dig back out of drought. We can see a really good snow year where we dig out more quickly, but when we have more average type years, it takes quite a while to muscle out of these types of conditions. And then if we look at the same map, but for temperature, here we are looking at how things rank versus the historical distribution in terms of average temperature, and we see that it was the hottest year on record going back to 1895 for California and Arizona, and then a top 5 hot year for Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico, and it's up there for Wyoming and Oregon. So definitely a warm year, and of course our temperature conditions are not in a steady state. Our climate is warming, so that is a part of this. And then the other big thing is when you have dry conditions, that often comes hand in hand with warm conditions in our region, as it's generally a trade-off between, are we spending more time baking under high pressure ridges, or are we getting more storms either dropping in from the northwest or coming out of the west and bringing some good Pacific moisture? So when we have those storms, we tend to see cooler. So definitely fitting well within the hot and dry mode over the last calendar year. And then kind of the most extreme portion of that was the portion of the year from June through September. Again, this is the time of year where we see drought impacts hit the hardest. Also, it was critically hot and dry during this time frame. We're looking at the Standardized Precipitation Evapotranspiration Index, or SPEI, which factors in both the influence of temperature and precipitation on the surface water conditions. And we're seeing SPEIs well below the -2 mark, even below the -2.5 mark in places like central Arizona and portions of Nevada and Utah. That's reflective of D4 conditions. In fact, much of the area covered in red we can essentially think of as D4 conditions, and this led to one of really an unprecedented fire season across much of the Southwest U.S. Certainly California and Colorado saw many acres burned in the summer and fall of 2020. If we look forward to recent months, here is a map of the snowpack accumulation to date. So we're about 2/3 of the way through the snowpack accumulation season. And actually, if you asked me to look at these numbers in a vacuum, they're not too bad. We're seeing conditions largely in the 80 to 100% of normal range for this time of year. I am concerned about regions like northern Utah, where we're seeing lower than 80% of normal. That takes a few good storms to dig out of, but if we're looking at, say, the western basins of Colorado, which are really important to overall runoff in the upper Colorado River Basin, these deficits are in the range of 1.5 to 2 inches of snow water equivalent. So really one good storm behind. And again, that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if we were just looking at this in the vacuum. But if we look at our groundwater conditions, we see that we went into this season with really low antecedent soil moisture, low base flows in terms of stream flow, and a really shallow water table. So it's going to take some extra water at some point to start to make that up. As is, we expect our runoff is likely to be less efficient than normal, as our soils are quite thirsty right now, and a lot of our snowpack is going to filter into the soils before ending up in lakes, streams, and reservoirs. Our reservoirs themselves are also on the lower end of normal, and of course, if you look at our reservoir giants in the area, like Lake Mead and Lake Powell, this problem certainly precedes the current drought. But for instance, Lake Powell is at only 54% of its average storage, based on that 1981 to 2010 normal. We don't see a dot for Lake Mead here, but it's also between 50 and 60% of normal for this time of year in terms of storage. And then if we look at smaller reservoirs throughout much of the upper Colorado River Basin and the greater Southwest area, we're storing less water than we have historically. So we have thirsty soils and thirsty reservoirs. So a little bit shy of average snowpack just isn't going to get the job done. If we take a look forward to the next few months, this is the Climate Prediction Center forecast for March, April, May. It's a probabilistic forecast, so we're showing whether there's increased probabilities of below normal precipitation or increased probabilities of above normal precipitation. You see that the probabilities are skewed towards higher chance of below normal over the March, April, May timeframe. I should also mention, there's about 10 days left in February. February, the remainder of the month is looking like it may be a little bit on the drier side, but will largely, conditions that we see right now will largely persist in terms of the snowpack percent of normals. I expect those not to change much over the next 10 days. This forecast is driven by both statistical and dynamical models. So we are in a La Nina year, and La Nina springs, there isn't much historical precedent for wet extremes, if any, across the Southwest US. As you get further north into northern Colorado and Utah, and even into Wyoming, there's a bit more historical precedent for having wet years or wet springs during La Nina conditions. Just the further southwest you go, the rougher it gets. Also, in terms of overall climatology, the March, April, May, or especially as we get into April, May, tends to get into the dry season for the southern portion of our Southwest region. But if you look at the northern portion, it's more the wet season. So just in terms of climatological precipitation distribution, there's more chance for us to make things up in the northern fringes of where we're seeing this current drought. So I think that's about all I've got for you today, but just a couple takeaway points that I wanted to rehash before leaving you here. Cold weather puts drought impacts on hiatus, but we're still dealing with considerable deficits from 2020, as 2020 definitely fell into the hot and dry end of the historical distribution. Region-wide snowpack is below historical averages. Like I said, if you're looking at snowpack in a vacuum, it's not terrible for most places, but when you consider the antecedent conditions going into this winter season, it's really going to take more to bust this drought. And then spring conditions could make a significant impact either way at this point. Certainly a wet spring could do a lot to dig us out of drought, but if you look at forecasts from places like the Climate Prediction Center, they tend to favor drier conditions to persist. So it definitely makes sense to be prepared for a low runoff year at this point.